right, welcome everyone to today's lecture on the neurophilosophy of memory with a little bit of imagination. So let me start today by talking about this word memory, which is actually quite polysemous. What does it mean to say that someone has good memory? So it turns out that the term memory could mean lots of different things. You can say of a person that she has a really good memory, and mean by that she has a really big storage for information. But memory can also refer to the process of retrieving that information, let's say the process of remembering. Now, other people might say, look, she has a really, really good memory, but they don't mean that she has really a lot of information in that storage or that the storage is really big. But in particular, they might mean that they have particular mental states that have certain properties that are different from other mental states, say perceptions or dreams or imagination. Memory can also refer to a property of the stored information as opposed to the information itself, right? Some people might refer to memory in terms of the experience. I am having a memory experience as opposed to referring to memory as the storage of the information that brings about that experience or the process of bringing out that information from that storage. So we use the term memory to refer to all sorts of different things. And as a result, when we talk about the neurophilosophy and the neuroscience of memory, it is important to know exactly what we mean by the term. Now, difficulties with definition of memory aside, what scientists try to do is to sort of sidestep that concern and talk instead in terms of operationalizations. How do you operationalize the term memory? So here are some examples that I would like to bring out, and then you're going to identify that there are some problems with them. So take, for instance, the first example of this operationalization of the term memory. Behavioral changes as a consequence of an experience. If you take any textbook in the neuroscience or in the psychology of memory, you might find this as a definition. The problem, of course, is that there are lots of behavioral changes that result or are a consequence of a previous experience that you wouldn't call a memory. For instance, if you eat something that it is past its due date, you might have a tummy ache. You wouldn't say, however, that that is a memory of what you ate. It is now, however, a behavior that is a consequence of a previous experience. Likewise, if you get sunburn in your skin, you will have a consequence, which is that you're going to have a rash or something like that, but you wouldn't call that a memory of having been exposed to sun. So it seems as though this definition is too broad. Another possibility is to operationalize the term memory as the capacity to remember previous experiences or previous information. Now, the problem with this operationalization, of course, is that it's rather circular because it is defining memory in terms of remembering. And we think that remembering is the process by means of which memory retrieves information from that storage, right? Another possibility, too, is to talk about memory in terms of the retention of internal representations of past events. The problem is that this is already a very theoretically laden definition or operationalization of memory because it already commits you to the idea that there are internal representations that somehow store the information that you experienced in the past. And as we are going to see, this is a very contentious claim. So this brief introduction just wants you to bring to bear the fact that this notion of memory not only is polysemous as a folk psychological term, but also is very difficult to articulate a clear-cut operationalization that is precise enough to only capture the terms, the concept that we want to study, and also that it is not too broad so as to include things that we don't want to include in memory. So as it happens, we're going to have to move on without a precise characterization of memory, but something like just this vague idea that we all have to begin with. All right. With that caveat in mind, what I would like to do in this just 1 hour presentation is to go over 3 specific questions that both philosophers and neuroscientists have been interested in. These are by no means exclusive, by no means an exclusive list of things that we can study from the point of view of the neurophilosophy of memory, but are 3 questions that have been perhaps studied the most at the intersection between the neuroscience and the philosophy of memory. The first general question is, what is memory? And within that sort of general question, we're going to have two sub-questions. The first one is, how can we distinguish memory from imagination? And the second one is, how many different kinds of memory are there? The second big question that we're going to discuss is, what exactly do memory do? Like, what is exactly the operation that memory does? Now, a typical response, and perhaps an obvious response, is that what memory does is to remember, right? But as we're going to see, that answer is somewhat contentious. Within the context of the science of memory, scientists typically distinguish these three stages of operation, one that is called encoding, storage, and retrieval. We're going to talk about that. In addition to that, we're going to talk about what this remembering thing that we think memory does. And we're going to see that philosophers disagree, as well as neuroscientists, as to exactly what does remembering consist in. And finally, we're going to touch a little bit about this debate as to how exactly memory and imagination interact. And the final question is a question about what we remember. So in a sense, it would seem pretty obvious that the answer is that what we remember is the past. But we're going to see that the answer turns out to be really tricky. So we're going to discuss this question in the context of two sub-questions. One is what our memory is about, and the second one, which is a typical answer, is that the carriers of that which memories are about are called memory traces. So we're going to talk about the nature of memory traces a little bit. So hope you're all ready. All right, let's start off talking about memory using this old way of thinking about categories that we learned from Aristotle. The strategy, as he calls it, is strategy of per genus et differentiam. Basically, the idea is to identify what a thing is by telling us under which category is subsumed, and as such, how it is distinguished from other things within that category. And in addition to that, what are subcategories that belong to it, right? So we're going to identify the difference and the genus or the category to which it belongs to. So we can think of memory as a faculty that is different from other cognitive faculties, such as imagination, perception, and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, we can think of memory as being a process that itself is constituted by some other kinds of processes. So what are those faculties that memory is distinguished from, and what are those subclasses that belong to memory? That is the question that we're going to try to tackle next. So in fact, that very same question is the question that many neuroscientists have been asking for quite some time. And the story, even though it is, as many of these stories is a little bit more nuanced, is typically traced back to the case of this individual that is known in the literature as H.M., but now we know that his actual name was Henri Monson. H.M. was one of the most famous patients in the history of neuropsychology, perhaps. Turns out that H.M. had intractable epilepsy, suffered from very severe epilepsy, and when he was very young, he had a bike accident that exacerbated his epilepsy. So when I mean exacerbated, it is really, really debilitating. So people might know that when you have epilepsy, there are typically two kinds of attacks that you can have. A petit malade, that it is called, when a person sort of loses consciousness for a little bit of time. But then there are obviously the grand malades. The grand malades is when seizures occur and the whole body is shaken and so forth. A person with a very severe epilepsy might have a couple of grand malades per semester, right? And then maybe a few petit malades, once every week or so. And apparently, it was the case with HM that in the more severe stages of his condition, he will have several grand malades per day. So it was so extraordinarily debilitating that he had to drop out of school. It was very, very difficult for him to go on. So difficult it was that in his 20s, he went to see a doctor, and then the doctors determined that the right course of action was to intervene in his brain and to remove the hippocampi, the miotemporal lobes. And then there you can see on the screen the original depictions of how the surgery went. But the point is that after the surgery, when his hippocampi have been removed in both sides of the brain, HM developed an extraordinary deficit in his memory. Specifically, he was completely unable to encode new information about experiences. So if you can see in the panel, the yellow panel, there are three ways of talking about amnesia. One way of talking about amnesia is what is called anterograde amnesia, in which what occurs is that previous memories prior to the accident, in this case the surgery, are preserved, but experiences that happen after the surgery are completely gone in the sense that they cannot be encoded. Retrograde amnesia refers to the opposite effect, is when you have an accident and anything that happens prior to the accident is gone, but after the accident people can encode information again. And of course you can have cases of complete amnesia, in which what occurs is that memories prior to and memories from after the accident are completely gone. In the case of HM, they tell us that he had a profound anterograde amnesia, but he had some retrograde amnesia in the sense that it appears as though he was able to still remember some events that happened to him prior to the accident, but after the accident, no information was encoded again. Interestingly, after the event, after the surgery happened, and HM had so much difficulty and with actual quite impossibility encoding new memories from experiences, it was tested that there were certain things that nevertheless he was able to learn. And in one of the most perhaps famous experiments with HM, Dr. Brandon Milner tested his ability to learn a very complex motor skill task. The task consisted in drawing inside of the contours of a star-shaped thing. But the tricky thing is that he was doing it not by looking at his hand at the pen directly, but rather by looking at the reflection of his hand and his pen directly. If you try to do it at home, you'll notice that it is very, very difficult, and you're going to make errors. Namely, you're going to be outside of the borders of the star quite often. However, with practice, you will get better. This is exactly what happened with HM. He started off making all the same mistakes that you will make the first time around, but then the second day that he was tested on that very same task, he made fewer errors, until, as you can see on the screen, it was basically flat, namely errorless. Now, interestingly, when Dr. Milner would ask him, "Do you remember having made this task before?" he would say, "No, I've never done it before." Nevertheless, his practice and his performance, it was very clear that he had learned from previous exposures. This generated the idea then that there was some kind of memory, say call it back at the time procedural memory, that was still preserved in someone like HM, namely someone that lacked a hippocampus. It was more his declarative memory, his memory about experiences, things that in order for you to remember them, you need to be able to be consciously aware of encoding them, and also be able to be consciously aware at the time of declaring them. That was the memory that was impaired, but his procedural memory apparently was intact. Later on, Larry Squire, also depicted here on the screen, conducted a series of parallel studies with other cases of individuals with amnesia due to temporal lobe damage, and in particular due to deterioration of the hippocampus. And as you can see, for various reasons, so there were Korsakoff patients that have brain accidents, and so on and so forth, all of which compromised the hippocampus. And as you can see, they all follow the exact same pattern, in the sense that they all seem to be able to learn new procedures, new skills, and still incapable of encoding new episodic or new experiential information. More importantly, so what this suggests, right, is that the brain structures that are involved in our capacity to encode and then to retrieve episodes of our ordinary life, which is what was impaired in HM, might be different from the brain structures that are in charge of helping us to learn skills like that of drawing the contours of a star. So this was a very important insight that led to a series of studies showing that actually the brain regions that are engaged in procedural as opposed to declarative memory are different. In particular, it has been shown that skill learning depends on a circuit that involves the motor cortex, the thalamus, and the striatum, but not the hippocampus. So here, for instance, you can see in the plot this nice dissociations showing that individuals that have miotemporal lobe damage have no trouble learning a statistical task like this one, which is the Wisconsin sorting card task, in which what matters is the statistical pattern of learning. Individuals with amnesia due to miotemporal lobe damage have no trouble learning the statistical regularities of these tasks. However, when you had damage in the striatum, like it is the case with individuals with Parkinson's disease, this task becomes extremely difficult. However, when the task consists in remember specific instances of the cards that you are to remember, which is a task that involves declarative memory, individuals with miotemporal lobe damage are really, really impaired. By contrast, individuals with Parkinson's disease and with deterioration in the striatum have no trouble remembering. This, in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive neuropsychology, is known as a double dissociation. You can see exact difference in performance as a function of damage in two separate areas in the brain. This very nice double dissociation between declarative and non-declarative, or sometimes called implicit memory, led to the first big branch in what it is known as the standard model of memory. So we have on the one hand memories for events that occur in your life, and also, as we will see, also memory for facts and for semantic information. And then we have on the other hand non-declarative or implicit memory, namely memory for things that we don't need to be consciously aware of having learned at the time of learning, or being consciously aware of having learned at the time of retrieval. Further divisions happen along the way. So, for instance, researchers started to separate different kinds of implicit or non-declarative memory that are associated with discrete parts of the brain. So, for instance, the skills and habits, which is the one that I just talked about, is associated with the striatum and the motor cortex and the cerebellum. Priming, which is another kind of implicit memory in which the exposure to a particular material increases the probability of you remembering aspects of that material regardless of whether you were aware of not during the learning stage, and that seems to be associated with the neocortex. We also have some other basic associative learning like emotional responses and skeletal musculature responses, almost reflex-like, that are associated, if they are emotional, with the amygdala and sometimes a little bit with the hippocampus, but mainly with the amygdala. And also, if they're skeletal muscular, they are typically associated with the cerebellum. And finally, of course, there are reflex pathways that are associated with non-associative learning, Pavlov kind of learning. By contrast, then we have in declarative memory this very important distinction between our capacity to remember conceptual or factual information, like what the capital of Venezuela is, versus event or episodic information, which is information about events that we personally experienced. And the relationship between these two becomes a little bit tricky, so let's spend a little bit time talking about it. So this distinction between factual or experiential information is known now in the literature as the distinction between episodic versus semantic memory. And the term we owe, at least contemporaneously, to Endel Tulving. What he meant by episodic memory was memory for particular spatiotemporal information that we acquire by directly experiencing the event. This information is supposed to be personal, and according to Tulving, it is associated with a particular kind of consciousness that he denominated autonoetic consciousness, your consciousness or your awareness of having been yourself, or being yourself the person who experienced that particular event. So I'll give you an example. Suppose that you learned while you are in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, that Caracas is the capital of Venezuela. Now, The memory that Caracas is the capital of Venezuela is a semantic memory. You could have learned it anywhere. You just happened to learn it when you were in Caracas, Venezuela. But the memory of you learning that Caracas is the capital of Venezuela, that personal experience, that counts then as an episodic memory, okay? So it's a different kind of association with the information. So semantic memory then, by contrast, is going to be memory about facts or semantic information. It need not be directly experienced. You can learn that, America was discovered in 1492, and of course you weren't there. Nevertheless, it is part of your memory. So you don't need to have that direct experience. And as a result, when you remember that, Caracas is the capital of Venezuela, you don't need to bring to mind any kind of awareness of the moment in which you learned about that particular fact, right? And as a result, the kind of awareness is not autonoetic, it's just basically noetic. Part of this distinction was also established by looking at neuropsychological cases. In this particular case, the case of Casey Ken Cochrane. Kane was an individual that had difficulty storing new episodic information. Nevertheless, he seemed to be able to encode new semantic information. And this dissociation between those two was sufficient for Tolving to suggest that maybe these two kinds of memories depended on different neural structures. Perhaps more striking is the case of developmental amnesia. So developmental amnesia is a kind of amnesia in which also happens as a result of damage in the hippocampus, but the damage occurs when individuals are very young. They have not matured enough. So in this particular case, there are 3 individuals that have amnesia as a result of damage in the hippocampus while they were kids, when they were like young children. These are 3 individuals, Beth, John, and Kate. Importantly, even though they had difficulty and perhaps were completely unable to encode new episodic information, they nonetheless were able to encode semantic and factual information. So much that they actually managed to finish high school. So this is a clear case, it looks like, between a difference between episodic and semantic information, namely the difference that they depend on different brain structures. Now, the problem, and here's where the neurophilosophy kicks in, is that this story is all nice and good, but most likely, if not false, at least somewhat inaccurate. Here's one of the things in which this story, the standard model of memory, is inaccurate. First of all, the textbook explanation of HM is likely inaccurate and sometimes just downright false. First of all, it seems to be the case that HM was actually able to learn some new semantic information. One of the most interesting observations from Sue Corkin, who was the neuropsychologist that studied him for pretty much all of his life, is that HM was able to answer some crosswords, the clues of which ask for answers of events that happened after his surgery. And nevertheless, he was able to respond correctly to those cues. So how could it be possible that he could respond to the semantic information of events that occurred after his accident if allegedly he could not encode new semantic information after that happened? So it looks as though HM was still able to learn some new semantic information. In addition to that, it is not true, or apparently is not true, that HM's damage was exclusive to his memory, right? So in fact, there is some research that suggests that he had some difficulty with language, including distinguishing some ambiguous sentences like "I don't feel like pleasing salesman," and also some difficulty retrieving infrequent words, as well as some difficulty distinguishing infrequent words from pseudo words. There is also some evidence to the fact that he had some perceptual difficulties, like this task, called sometimes out of place task, in which you have to identify objects that are out of place in high dimensional discrimination. Like if you find a fish tank inside of a garbage can in a classroom. That seems to require all sorts of different levels of discriminations, and then there is some evidence to the fact that HM actually had difficulty with such perceptually discriminating tasks. It is also very likely that HM had complete retrograde amnesia, contrary to what people suggest, that he had preserved the memories from prior to the accident. It looks as though he actually had very few, if any, autobiographical memories from his past, and some of them were rather semanticized as opposed to very, very episodic. This also raises concerns to the notion of consolidation, which is a term that is supposed to refer to when the encoded information gets sort of crystallized, fixed into a memory trace. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, it is very questionable that HM was able to learn new skills. You can see here in the right side of the screen a plot that shows the performance of controlled subjects and the performance of HM in two tasks where he was somewhat able to learn. As you can see, his performance was really never comparable with that of controls. And these are only two of several tasks in which he was trained, and these were the only two in which he sort of learned. The other ones he didn't. So the record really should show that he was only successful to learn a couple of tasks that are supposed to be, aimed at skill learning. In reality, he was unable to learn way many more tasks that were supposed to be able to tap at skill learning. So one has to look at the record really in full and realize that HM was really not able to learn much skills, to be honest. Here's more problems for this standard model of memory. Further evidence coming from the last decade or so has shown that actually the hippocampus seems to be engaged in working memory, which is something that HM was supposed to have intact, although we don't know because, again, he was only tested with a couple of tests about 50 years ago, and the notion of working memory has also been developed. More evidence suggests that the hippocampus is engaged in motor skill learning. So what we're seeing is that the picture is far from being as clear-cut as the standard model suggests. So the question is, do we have then any alternative models for the different kinds of memories? Well, some people have suggested some. So this is a model that I really like that was suggested about 14 years ago by Katharina Henke, in which what she suggests is that instead of thinking about the initial category in terms of conscious awareness, like declarative and non-declarative, we should rather think of different kinds of memory in terms of processing modes. And then we'll think if the memory is processed fast, or if it takes a while to learn, or if it is very flexible versus if it is inflexible, then it gives you a different categorization. But this is only one of many possible categories. And the truth is, it is a very active area of research, and there is no alternative model to the traditional model. So in sum, we have seen that memory is a very polysemous term, that different kinds of operationalization are either too broad and include concepts that are above and beyond what we want memory to be, or end up to be too theoretically laden so as to remove the possibility, like the idea of thinking of memory as the storing of representations that are already too theoretically baggaged with a particular view of memory, and then would exclude alternative ways of thinking about memory. In addition to that, we have seen that the standard model of memory, which was allegedly very well grounded on empirical findings from neuropsychology and neuroscience on humans and non-human animals, is actually highly questionable, and today is a very active area of research to see which is the best taxonomy for different kinds of memory and why.